The views and opinions expressed in this video are those of the speakers and panelists, and do not necessarily reflect the position of the ETHOS Institute for Public Christianity and its founding institutions and organizations.
Bioethics,
law, euthanasia,
consumerism,
politics, terrorism,
globalization,
religion,
migrant population,
interfaith, drug addiction.
And we want to start by talking about the young earth creation position. And I would like to start by describing it. So according to this position, God created the universe fairly recently, about 10,000 years ago, and formed the earth to be fit for humans over the next 6 days, which are to be understood as 6 literal 24-hour days, consecutive, one after the other. And on the last of these days, God created man in his own image. Furthermore, God's creative acts were what we might call fiat miracles. God said it, and it happened. The universe did not originate or develop according to slow, random, mindless, purposeless natural processes, nor did living creatures or man. Third, Adam and Eve are literal historical persons. By the way, I hope you like these PowerPoints. I had to pay these people a lot of money to take off their clothes and jump in the river. Okay, so Adam and Eve, of course, literal historical persons. There was no death of any kind prior to the fall. It was the fall of man that brought both spiritual and physical death and decay into the creation. The fall caused a radical transformation of the natural world. And many young earth creationists will argue that the fall and the curse is the cause of the second law of thermodynamics, which mandates that things tend to decay, energy is used up and dispersed so that it's no longer usable and that sort of thing. And they equate that with the decay that's in the natural world. The flood of Noah was a worldwide event that radically reshaped the geological structures of the world, and probably also the climatic conditions as well. And the flood is the main factor in the number and the distribution of the fossils in the fossil record. The dinosaurs, along with all other forms of prehistoric life that are now extinct, were created during the initial creation week, and they coexisted with man. What happened to them? Well, young earth creationists have speculated that members of smaller dinosaur species could have been taken on the ark, and for the larger species, younger specimens, immature specimens, could have been taken aboard. And then, of course, so they didn't have to fit in things like Brachiosaurus or what have you, but a young specimen, and then after the flood they would be released and, of course, could grow back to maturity. Now, regardless of this, though, the dinosaurs did die out, probably as a result of the changed conditions after the flood. And not all young earth creationists would argue this, but many of them would find evidence in the Bible of dinosaurs. So, for example, in Job 40, when it speaks of Behemoth, and in Job 41, when it talks about Leviathan, there are some interpreters that would see reference to dinosaurs in these passages. And finally, by way of description, some young earth creationists are more flexible on the time scale, noting that you can't just add up the genealogies, noting that in many places the records of human existence go back before 4000 BC. Of course, so, even just in China, okay, records of civilization go back prior to that. So they would be a bit more flexible. It might not just be 10,000 years, but they would still tend to calculate the age of the universe and the earth in the order of tens of thousands of years. Okay. Okay, so that's how I would describe this viewpoint. I hope that was fair, if that's your position. Let me say a few things about what I perceive to be the strengths of this approach. I would say that if you just pick up the Bible and read it, I have to grant that the young earth interpretation of the Genesis accounts has the greatest initial intuitive plausibility. If you simply read the accounts, at least in English, most people would probably immediately conclude that the young earth creationist interpretation is what the text is intending to say. And so I'm willing to grant that that position deserves the benefit of the doubt, and contrary positions, like my own, should be willing to accept a bit of the burden of proof on this issue and need to demonstrate that they're at least as plausible as the young earth creationist position. I would also commend the young earth creationist position that I think we could say it's clearly motivated by the desire to be faithful to God and His Word. And it vigorously resists accommodation to naturalism. And I consider that to be a virtue. Historically, many young earth creationists were willing to stand alone against the ridicule of an entire culture that was triumphalistically promoting Darwinism. In fact, I remember there was a course I took in scientific apologetics, and our professor made us read a lot of this early young earth creationist literature, and also read the writings of people like Isaac Asimov, and this is around in the 1950s and 1960s, and they sounded exactly alike, mirror images, and there's a great deal of cultural hostility, and I think it takes a certain amount of bravery to stand up to that. And so I don't know why this picture reminded me of that, but you got this cat walking past all the German shepherds, you know, and so I find that to be a virtue as well. Furthermore, the young creationist position preserves the special status of man as different in kind from other animals, not just different in degree. Man is not just another animal. Man is a special creation of God, the only creature that has been created in God's image. And this accounts for the obvious fact that man is simply qualitatively different from other animals. He's not just a little bit more than, a little bit more rational, a little bit more developed, etc. We have qualities that are absolutely lacking in other creatures: rationality, abstract thinking, trying to think about, you know, what is justice, what is goodness, what is beauty, what is the nature of truth, eternity, things like that. We have creativity, we have morality. And I think as Christians, we should be absolutely unashamed to speak of the distinctness of man. I remember when I was in undergraduate days in college, I had a class where a bunch of people, it was kind of philosophical, and we would sit around in a circle and we would discuss these kind of things. And the professor put forward the question, how many of you think that man is different, or human beings are different in kind, not just different in degree? And I put my hand up, and two other people did. And the outspoken class atheist kind of sneered and said, the Christians. I said, that's right, I'm not ashamed to affirm this. Pick any species. How many? I give you 1 billion generations. Do you think any other species will ever have a discussion like this? Now, of course, I can't ever have to pay on the bet because it's 1 billion generations. But I think even if I had a time machine, I'm not afraid to make that bet. Okay? Dolphins, dogs, no matter what wonderful creature you have, their descendants are never going to be able to have a discussion like this. I think we're different in kind. And the young earth creationists certainly affirm that. Furthermore, when they do biology, I don't know about across the board, but a lot of times I think in biology, young earth creationists do put forward, I think, some strong criticisms against neo-Darwinism and evolutionary theory in general. They speak about the problems with the naturalistic origin of life, the insufficiency of neo-Darwinian mechanisms to generate new species and macroevolutionary transformation, and evidence from the fossil record that these kinds of transformations have not occurred. And so in terms of biology, I don't have a lot of a problem with them there, and I think that's quite good. And last, in terms of, it's the same guys. So they're representatives on both of these counts. This is Paul Nelson on the right and Ray Bolin, I believe, on the left. There are some young earth creationists that are also quite open-minded and working with Christians from different creation perspectives, and they'll join together in the intelligent design movement to overturn the Darwinian paradigm to free science from the grip of naturalism. And they don't insist that we have to agree on all these issues and things like age of the earth in order to work together to deal with a problem that we all agree, and really, I would say, the so-called foe of Darwinism and methodological naturalism. That is a very good thing. We don't have to agree about everything to be part of the same family in Christ and to work together, okay? And let me say also, at my day job at Singapore Bible College, we don't all agree on these matters, but yet we work together for the cause of Christ. Okay, and that's, I think, the right mentality. Now, those are what I consider the strengths. What are the problems? Not necessarily weaknesses. There could be answers. There could be solutions to these problems. But I put them out as things that need to be addressed. I would suggest to you that young earth creationists do not pay enough attention to cultural background in reading the text. When reading any text, the cultural context is just as important as the general context or the literary context. We have to consider these things when we are determining what the author intended to say. And when we apply this to Genesis, the culture of the ancient Israelites is more important than our culture today. So before we can figure out what the text means for us today, we have to figure out what it meant to the ancient Israelites. And when we do that, the 24-hour interpretation doesn't seem as obvious as it did at the start, if the ancient Israelites read it with a different set of questions than we are. I would suggest that there are some indications within the text that the author may intend something besides the young earth creation or 24-hour day interpretation. And I would say, at the least, other interpretations are permitted by the text. And at the most, perhaps someone could arguably say that the 24-hour day interpretation is unlikely to be what the author intended. And we'll pick this idea up when we look at the old earth perspective, and you can sort of judge whether or not that has any plausibility for you. Okay? Now, in terms of integrating the Bible and science, I think there is a problem that young earth creationists have to face. I think it's a little bit of a dilemma. They need to make a choice. One, either they can argue that the legitimate scientific evidence actually points to a young universe, or they can argue in a different fashion to say, two, that God created the universe in general in a mature state, such that there is a thoroughgoing appearance of age. It seems to me they have to choose one or the other. These approaches, I don't think, can work very well if they're combined. Very often, young earth creationists will inconsistently combine both approaches, and I think they're forced to make a choice. It's especially problematic when young earth creationists take approach number one. They put forward evidence that the universe or the earth is really young. But then, when that argument is falsified, then they resort to strategy number two, to say that it was created with an appearance of age. And that just has a sort of ad hoc quality to me, that to avoid allowing the young earth position to be falsified. I think if God created the universe with the appearance of age, then it's going to look old, and you're not going to be able to appeal on Monday to the scientific evidence that things are young, and then fall back on this other position on Tuesday. So they have to choose one or two. But it's a dilemma because both options have their problems, okay? So the first one, in terms of the evidence, if they're going to take the first approach, I would say to you that the scientific evidence is overwhelmingly solid against a young universe and a young earth, and against a worldwide flood, a worldwide global flood, at least in human history. I would even go further and say there is no evidence for a young universe and earth that withstands scrutiny. Now, I've already told you a couple of times I'm not a scientist. So I'm not going to belabor this point, but you might be wondering, how do I even dare to make the point if I'm not a scientist? Let me just say this. I'm approaching this as a scientifically informed layman, okay? And I'm addressing you. I don't even know. Some of you maybe have backgrounds in the sciences, but at least with the understanding that we can all be scientifically informed laymen. And I will just say that I've read enough of the relevant literature. I've seen the flaws in many of the young earth creationist arguments for the age of the earth and the universe. And I'm confident to say that for just about any of these arguments, I have read the refutation somewhere. Now, if you ask me about it in Q&A, I might not remember, but I probably got it in a book on my shelf or notes on my computer. I'm not a scientist. I'm not authoritative. I don't have these facts on hand, so to speak. You could bring up anything from the blue, right? But if you really are concerned about this, you want to dialogue with me on email about a particular argument that you've heard, I could probably find you some relevant literature about it, okay, and respond to your email. Some old earth creationists have claimed to have refuted over 100 of these young earth creationist scientific arguments and pointed out their scientific flaws. Now, I'm not a scientist, and let's just assume you're not scientists. How can we be confident of this evaluation? I would like to suggest to you, from a layman's perspective, a certain rule of thumb that can help us to evaluate the strength of the evidence. And I find the following consideration to be quite compelling. Consider the following. Scientists of all religious, philosophical, political, ideological, what have you, persuasion, find the scientific evidence for the Big Bang Theory, the age of the universe, and the age of the earth to be quite compelling. The only scientists who believe the earth is young are those who are first convinced that the Bible must be read that way. And that suggests to me that there must be something compelling about the evidence that draws people of such diverse philosophical background to find it convincing. Whereas on the other side, it seems like it's something other than the evidence that's driving them to that conclusion. Paul Nelson and John Mark Reynolds defend the young earth creation position in the Zondervan Counterpoint series book called 3 Views on Creation and Evolution. And they clearly concede that at present the scientific case for an old universe is overwhelming. They say this: natural science seems to overwhelmingly point to an old cosmos, though creationist scientists have suggested some evidences for a recent cosmos, none are widely accepted as true. It is safe to say that most recent creationists are motivated by religious concerns. Presently, we can admit that as recent creationists, we are defending a very natural biblical account at the cost of abandoning a very plausible scientific picture of an old cosmos. But over the long term, this is not a tenable position. In our opinion, old earth creationism combines a less natural textual reading with a much more plausible scientific vision. They have few problems of science. At the moment, this would seem the more rational position to adopt. And they go on to say, recent creationism must develop better scientific accounts if it is to remain viable against old earth creationism. Now, they took a lot of criticism from their fellow young earth creationists for that statement, but that's their read of the state of the evidence, okay? But as well, I would say that the testimony of young earth creationists like John Morris, the son of Henry Morris, a geological engineer, and at one time, I don't know if he still is, but president of the Institute for Creation Research, he once acknowledged in a radio interview that he has never met or heard of a scientist who became convinced on the basis of the evidence alone that the universe or that the earth is only thousands of years old. And the radio host who interviewed Morris, his name is Jon Stewart, not the one from The Daily Show, but he interviewed him for over an hour, and he said unequivocally, no, he's never heard of any, he doesn't know any scientist, nor has he heard of any scientist that has been convinced by the evidence. And I would suggest to you there is no evidence. And Morris, for 5 years, interviewed many young earth creationists, and never once could any affirm that they knew of any scientist or had heard of any scientists who were persuaded by the evidence. And I think that's That's what I think speaks quite powerfully about the state of the evidence. Even though we might be laymen, this does, I think, give us some sense of what the evidence shows. So I think taking the option of arguing scientifically that the earth is young is really difficult, a difficult proposition. Now, what about the appearance of age? Well, God certainly could, and we know that God does miracles, and He produces things that, like whatever fish, that Christ multiplied to feed the 5,000, I'm sure weren't embryos, they wouldn't feed many people. So, certainly we don't deny the power of God to do such things. But there are certain implications and theological consequences of taking this approach that are very difficult to avoid and that I think should be unacceptable to us. It is, and young earth creationists don't believe this and they don't advocate this, they don't argue this way, but it's hard to avoid the implication that God is deceiving us. Think about it for a moment. One of the ways that we calculate how far away things are and distance and how old things are, we think in terms of light travel time. We know the speed of light. We know that light comes to us from billions of light years away, and that the light from some of the stars we've seen left that object billions of years ago. Okay, and of course God could have created that light in transit. He could have created it so from day one it's on the way already. But as light travels, things happen to it. It passes through dust and various things, and so the spectral lines broaden, it's red shifted and things like this. There are multiple things that happens to light as it travels, which also indicate the distance that it's traveled. Well, I guess God could have done that too. I don't know why. I don't know why He did it. I don't know what's so magical about 10,000 years that we have to be convinced that it's that way. But it seems like God is going to great lengths to make us think that this light has been traveling for billions of years and has traversed the entire distance from that space. And I have a hard time understanding the theological rationale for making it to appear as something other than what it is. But it gets even worse. And again, I'm putting this out there as a problem. And if you take the young earth creationist position, I'm not saying that this is some kind of fatal thing like from David's sling to Goliath's forehead, but I do think it's a problem that I want you to wrestle with and think about and take it seriously. The universe out there is not some static thing that never changes. And it wouldn't be so bad, I guess, if God created the light on the way. But stuff happens out there. Stuff moves. Stars come into existence, right? The nova event. Stars go out of existence if they're big enough in what's called a supernova event. They explode. And things happen out there. Things collide into one another. So we're not just seeing static, unchanging things out there. We're actually seeing the record of events. But if the universe is only 10,000 years old, we're seeing the record of events that never actually happened. They never happened. Supernovas that took place more than 10,000 light years distance. These events never happened. And it's very hard, I think, to avoid the conclusion that there's an implication here that God is going to great lengths to convince us of things that aren't so. And when I look in the Bible, it tells us that nature testifies of His creative power, and that we can look to creation and find truth. And so I find these implications to be very troubling. And I just can't go there. Much of the universe that we see is actually an illusion on this view. Think about this. Most of us would say, if we dug up a skeleton in a certain strata of rock, we would not say, and let's say we wouldn't say that let's say that apparently this rock is 5 million years old, let's say. Maybe we don't think there was an earth 5 million years ago. Well, maybe God could have created the rock and it has a certain appearance. But would you say that He put the skeleton there? that lived 5 million years ago when in fact no such animal had ever lived, but there's a skeleton there? Well, you know, there's something analogous going on whenever we look at limestone formations and sedimentary rock, coral reefs, which are in effect the skeletons of millions of microscopic creatures that were formed by metabolic biological processes over a long period of time. Coral reefs put out daily growth bands. There's also annual markers of growth. And these are the hard remains of creatures. And you don't form these things quick. These are biological metabolic processes. They synthesize calcium carbonate from seawater. You know, it's no different than the way we metabolize food. Okay? You know, these processes just can't happen fast. And they produce heat and things like that. Okay? These are creatures that, on this view of things, these are no different than the skeleton that we find in the ground. And we're saying these are creatures that never truly existed. These are the remains of these creatures. And the earth is full of things like that. And so there is a bit of a dilemma that we need to take seriously if we're going to take a young earth creation approach. On the one hand, we have scientific evidence which is not really supporting the position at all. On the other hand, we have an approach that can argue for appearance of age, but in many ways and in many aspects, it reduces the universe and the earth to an illusion and a record of things that in fact never happened. And boy, I really find that difficult. Another problem is that unfortunately many young earth creationists, this is not intrinsic to the position at all, and there are counterexamples I've mentioned, but there are many young earth creationists that are really antagonistic toward other views of creation and unfairly attack the character and motivations of their advocates as compromisers, traitors to the faith, and this sort of thing. And not so much from any evidence of that mindset, but just from the fact that they have a different position. And people of this type do not accept that the others could be disagreeing in good faith. And I think this is unfair and slanderous, and it really poisons the well so that many conservative, faithful Christians will not even hear a different position because they've been exposed to a straw man version that is impossible to reconcile with Christian faithfulness, and they're predisposed to believe the worst about anybody that suggests a different way. John Morris, whom I've mentioned, at one point said, "I'm uncertain about young earth creationism being a requirement for church membership. Perhaps it would be proper to give new members time to grow and mature under good teaching. But I do know one thing, young earth creationism should be made a requirement for Christian leadership. No church should sanction a pastor, Sunday school teacher, deacon, or Bible study leader who knowingly or knowledgeably and purposely errs on this crucial doctrine." And I don't know, I guess I wouldn't fit, you know, I have to work at McDonald's, I guess. And a related criticism, I think that the young earth creationists, especially of this particular stripe, are insisting, again, this is not intrinsic to the position, but it's common. It works out this way often. They're insisting that Christians should gamble their faith on young earth creationism. In their view, if young earth creationism is wrong, then Christianity is false. And no other positions are presented in such a way that, yeah, like we think this is less desirable, but it's possible. You know, they don't have any sense. It's all or nothing. And there's no sense of, well, I disagree with that position, but, you know, it's still possible a Christian can hold this in good faith. That's an option. And so if their view is discredited, the whole Christian faith is. Now, I think this is a misplaced emphasis. As Christians, we should have this all or nothing stand on the resurrection of Christ. I mean, assuming that Christ taught what he did and was crucified, and the evidence shows that he was raised from the dead, is that not sufficient to demonstrate the truth of Christianity, even if it turns out that we're mistaken about the details of creation and how we think of that? And secondly, I think that this is a very dangerous, high-stakes gamble that fails to prepare young Christians, especially, with intellectual resources to withstand the intellectual assault that they're going to face as they become an adult, they go into university, they go into the real world. In effect, I think we're training young people to fight with plastic swords and sending them off to fight dragons. And people depart from the faith for this reason. And so these are my concerns with young earth creationism. And if that's your perspective, I hope you sense I'm trying to approach this with as much charity and fairness as I can, but I hope you'll take these things and think about them. By the way, please do not come into this room as a young earth creationist and leave it an old earth creationist because of what I've just said to you. I think Christians should never change their minds quickly about anything of such importance. All I ask is that you take these things and think about them and see if after a period of testing and reflection, if they make sense to you and if they feel right. We should change our minds about things slowly. And so I'm not here to try to convert you. I'm not here to try to convert you. I just want you to think, okay? All right, now, young earth creationist, old earth creationist perspective. Now, of course, I'm biased and I'm in favor of this, so I put that out there. I acknowledge that, okay? In terms of description, in this view, the Bible does not directly address the issue of how old the universe is. But the Bible does allow for an old earth interpretation. And there are indications that the standard 24-hour creation days view is not what the author intended. Okay, so if I were to just give a sort of thumbnail sketch of one way of reading the Bible from an old earth perspective, I would describe it something like this. And by the way, I recommend, it's marked on your bibliography with an asterisk as being especially helpful. See John Collins, Science and Faith. I'm following his interpretation here of what he calls the analogical days approach, and I recommend that. That's worth checking out. And I'm basically getting this from him. But he would argue for something like this, that Genesis verses 1 and 2 give us the background action and conditions of the earth before the main action of the chapter. That's background material. The main action of the chapter does not start until verse 3. Creation day 1 does not start with verse 1. Creation day 1 starts with verse 3 that says, "And God said." You know, you look at every other creation day, it starts with, "And God said." Every single one of them. Now, there's one or two days where there's an additional divine command, "And God said," a second time. But every creation day, you see the end of the previous one, there was evening and there was morning, day X, and the very next sentence, "And God said." That's the start of every creation day. And from a literary perspective, we should understand verse 3 as the beginning of creation day 1. Verses 1 and 2 are background material and describe for us the creation of the entire universe, apparently up to the point at which the earth is in some solid state. And then the earth tells us about the condition of the earth at that point, formless and void. Now, formless and void are not suitable conditions for human beings living there. And so the text then goes on to tell us in a literary fashion of how God gives form to what was formless, days 1 to 3, and then how God fills what was empty. He fills the structures that he created on days 1 to 3. So days 4, 5, and 6, he's filling. And often you'll see these days correspond. So day 1, he creates certain structures, basically in the sky, day and night. And then he fills them, day 4, with the celestial objects. Okay, and you see this kind of parallel going through. Okay, so day 1 and 2, or verses 1 and 2, just tell us about this background action. God created the entire universe. He brought the earth into being at some point. And it doesn't really tell us how long that took. I don't think the biblical author had any interest. And it could be any amount of time. It could be 10 years. It could be hundreds of years or thousands or millions or billions. And the Bible is really, I think, indifferent to the answer there. And we're not violating any theological point. So by the way, you might be convinced that these are 6 24-hour days. You can hold to that and still believe that the universe is quite old, actually. Now, as we read the text, we should think in terms of what is our point of view. Very often when we read Genesis 1, we have this implicit point of view that's looking down on planet Earth and seeing the entire globe. Maybe like the astronauts on the moon. You know, there's the famous Earthrise picture that they took. And now we think of these things, we envision something like that. But really, that's a bit anachronistic, isn't it? Would the ancient Israelites have read it that way? Probably not. Maybe it would be more like this, that they would have looked out toward the horizon and seen the water and the sky. And it would be looking out horizontally, not down on the planet as a globe. In fact, the text, this is sort of should be the implied perspective, right? This would have been the way the Israelites saw the world. This is the way everybody saw the world until the 1960s, right? This would be what would be conjured up in the mind of the reader, surveying the world from this perspective, not looking down on the planet from outer space. This implied perspective is made a bit more clear, I think, in verse 2. The Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. So I would interpret much of what we read in the following text as it appears to an observer at this point. So when we consider the sun, moon, and stars, I would understand them as being created in the beginning. That this flexible notion of in the beginning that's not really defined in terms of time, it's kind of amorphous as a description in the text. Verses 1 and 2 basically take us up to the earth in a solid state. I think the sun and the moon and the stars were there, but they are not visible. Darkness was on the face of the deep. God says, let there be light. Light penetrates. Light is visible to an observer on the surface of the earth. Day 4, the objects responsible for that light are made visible. Okay? And the word create is not actually found in reference to day 4. Okay? And there's some details in there that I recommend you consult Collins on this, and the role that how God appointed these objects. They have a religious role. They define the beginning of new months. They define when you hold Passover and things like this. There's a certain way in which the sun and the moon governed the life of the Israelites.